What's up, everybody? Welcome to Sparrow Speaks. This is the next podcast, which is Philosophy of Language, with everybody's favorite intellectual, Benjamin. What's up, my brother?
Oh God, glad to be here.
I still remember, I think of that time, I think it was the first time you were on here when you said it was the most atrocious utterance ever spoken by the inheritor of the modern dialect's mouth.
Something like that.
Something like that. I had to go back and listen to it, but man, that's one of my favorite lines ever.
I was pretty off put.
All right, let's get into it. Philosophy of language. So, well, I guess that's just very basic. Like, what's your interest in it? What makes you focus on the philosophy of language as apart from other schools of philosophy branches?
Yeah, so I probably would say philosophy of language is what I've, at least as an undergraduate, I focused on the most. I wrote my thesis on and so forth. I think the main reason that I became very interested in the philosophy of language is because I had an initial interest in metaphysics, right, which is the branch of philosophy that studies tries to study what the most general features of reality are, and one of the kind of main debates in metaphysics is the realism versus anti-realism debate, which is basically the debate between people who think there's an objective way the world is, independent of our theories and the way we think about it, and anti-realists who think that there is no objective structure that the world has, but the way the world is, quote unquote, is dependent on our theories or whatever. So that made me start really thinking about the nature of representation and language generally, right? How, in particular through language, how do we, if at all, represent the world? How are our words connected up to the world, right? How do we refer to things? How does language how might language accurately reflect or fail to reflect the structure of reality? So that's kind of how I got interested in it. And then I got particularly interested in the theory of reference because I found a lot of the philosophical puzzles in that area very intriguing. So one of the classic ones that I wrote my thesis on is the problem of empty names, which is basically the puzzle that arises when you consider that it's plausible that the meaning of proper names is just what they refer to, right? Given a context of use, right? So in this context of use, Adam just means you, right? It just directly refers to you. So the way philosophers of language put this technically is the semantic value, right, of Adam is Adam, right? And so forth. And so there's a puzzle because there are certain empty names, of course, right? So say we happen to discover that the works of Shakespeare were actually written by multiple authors, then we might describe that discovery as the discovery that Shakespeare never existed. But if Shakespeare never existed, then there's nothing for the name Shakespeare to be referring to. So how can we meaningfully deploy the name if it doesn't have its semantic content,
Mm.
i.e., it's referent, right? Or we say Zeus does not exist, right? Um, if Zeus does not exist, then what are we predicating non-existence of? So that's one of the kind of like central puzzles and the theory of reference that I got very interested in. So yeah, I guess that's my background and how I got interested in the issues.
The first thing that occurs to me about when I learned very briefly philosophy of language is almost what I've noticed is it shows the importance of language as far as how it relates to reality. Like it gave me the impression that the thing that separates us from animals can very well be just the fact that we're able to use language because it,
Hmm.
it 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 gives like I guess a kind of depth to reality. Does Am I making sense?
No, yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah, that's something many linguists and philosophers and cognitive scientists have pointed out. I know, what's his name? I'm forgetting. He's one of the most famous cognitive scientists. I'm drawing a blank.
Is
Can
he
you think?
alive?
Yes, yes. What's his name? Oh, is it Andy Clark? I think Andy Clark. Anyway, but he described language. He talked about language as being that like unique thing that distinguishes us from the animals, because he said complex forms of language are like a tool. We use them as he says, an external scaffold, right? To kind of create a feedback loop that increases the complexity of our thinking, right? So you think of like, say, doing a mathematical operation, right? A very complex one. Well, our brains are naturally built to only be able to do fairly simple, right, operations in our mind. But if we have a language, say a formal mathematical language like algebra, or a system of symbols, then we can dramatically increase our ability to think and reason by using external symbols like that, especially the written word, but also vocally, um, to help us see more complex lines of reasoning and help us kind of reincorporate those external representations back into our internal cognitive representations. So yeah, you're right.
Yeah, that's like that struck me as being significant because for some reason I never made the connection that language itself is what we're building knowledge on, our understanding on. It always seemed like a not a trivial, but just I think when Wittgenstein wrote the Tractatus,
Hmm.
that's kind of how he represented language, or maybe I'm thinking of someone else, but that language was just I think it's called picture theory.
Hmm.
Can you explain that a little bit, or image, or
Yeah. So in certain interpretive circles, this might be controversial, but this is the standard reading of early Wittgenstein. Yeah. So the so most people believe that what he was arguing for, like you said in the Tractatus, um, was the idea that the primary thing that language does, at least when it's, when you're engaged in like declarative sentences and so forth, is try to correspond to reality, right? It's a picture of reality. So the idea is there's something isomorphic between our propositions and the states of affairs in the world, that they represent, right? And so a classic example, just think of like a basic subject predicate sentence. So say the cat is on the mat. Um, the the function of that statement and how it gets its meaning is that the cat just designates some constituent of a objective fact, right? A cat, it refers to a cat, or the cat in the presence of the speaker. And then is, right, is just just used for predication, and then we say on the mat, and the predicate just refers to the property, right? So the subject predicate form of sentence is isomorphic to the um, substance exemplifying a property structure, right? In reality, so yeah, there's just this kind of direct correspondence and mirroring between language and the world. And then later, Wittgenstein, again, most people think kind of went back on that, changed his mind, and said, no, actually, language is primarily uh, not it's not primarily used to represent the world, but it's used to do things in the world. Language is primarily a practical tool, even when it seems like we're just uttering normal declarative sentences. Still, the primary function is not to somehow accurately represent the structure of the world, but it's just to get something done in a particular context.
yeah,
These things are all quite vague. I like Wittgenstein, but there's a reason that there are so many interpretations of his thought.
I love like I think it was after he wrote that book, he like left philosophy. He's like, I solved all the problems. I've done it all. Or is that later in his life when he did that?
No, yeah, after the Tractatus, he was like, all right, philosophy's tapped, I'm out.
But yeah, like it. So it's interesting to because it's an interesting concept when you think of picture theory that because you're kind of saying that things exist in themselves, like you were saying, the cat on the mat. But the only way we're identifying those things is linguistically. It doesn't say anything about their true nature, and it's like it's just like another way. It seems like a kind of a skepticism type argument. It kind of reminds me of Hume, how
Hmm.
you're kind of stripping away the properties of something, and I think that's a pretty interesting way of doing something similar. But I don't really. So what's going on now in the philosophy of language as far as you know? And I know it's been changing a lot, and it's do you still consider it like is it still getting the same amount of attention as it used to?
It's definitely still a very vibrant field of philosophy, but I would say, in a certain respect, it's not the center of analytic philosophy as it used to be. Um, but I think the most important, more recent, as in like since the 70s, recent in philosophical time. Um, I think the most important recent development in the philosophy of language is a theory called semantic externalism. And it actually directly relates to these issues we're talking about right now about the relationship between language and the world. So, if I may give a brief history of semantic externalism.
Please do. Please do, my
Okay.
brother.
So, so up until the 1970s, stretching all the way back to Bertrand Russell, right in the 19 teens, and the logical positivists, the dominant view of paradigmatically referring terms, right? So like the paradigm ones would be proper names and like natural kind terms. Okay. So again, a proper name is obviously just like Ben, Adam, Jeffrey, Jones, whatever. A natural kind term would be like water, gold, rose, so forth. It picks out some sort of natural kind in your environment, or species. So the dominant view, again, for since the beginning of analytic philosophy, with Russell and Whitehead and et cetera, again at the turn of the century, was that the meaning of these terms could be reduced to a set of descriptions. So the meaning of, again, say, Adam is not just you. It doesn't directly refer to you. Rather, it means whatever descriptions I and others familiar with you tend to associate with you, right? So, for example, uh, for me, Adam would mean the unique X, such that X likes to podcast with me, and X was my peer at UCF, and X now is balling it up in NYC. Okay, so um, so that would be the meaning of your name. Okay, just these a general set of descriptions that I uniquely associate with you. Similarly, with natural kind terms, the meaning of water would be the unique X, such that X is colorless and odorless, and X is in lakes and rivers, and X falls from clouds from time to time, right? So that this was the dominant view, right? There are a set of properties or descriptions that we associate with a referring term, and that gives their meaning. So fast forward to the 70s, when two philosophers in particular, Saul Kripke and Hilary Putnam, who actually died last week, extraordinarily important philosophers. So they basically argued that this was wrong, that natural kind terms and proper names actually directly refer to things in the world in a way that none of the descriptions that we might conventionally associate with names or kind terms gives their meaning. Okay. And so they gave several arguments to demonstrate this. So I'll give a classic argument, Kripke gave for proper names. So there's a famous mathematician, Kurt Gödel. He proved the incompleteness theorem. So most people, if they know of Kurt Gödel, the only description that they associate with him, say, is the mathematician who proved the incompleteness theorem. Okay. So on a descriptivist view of the semantics of proper names, that would literally just be the meaning of Kurt Gödel for the.
Oh, I lost you. Benjamin! I can no longer hear you, Ben. Are you there? Oh no. Well, I guess I'll just keep going on here until Ben gets back, which hopefully will be very, very shortly. Looks like it's still online, so maybe it's just a microphone problem or something like that. But I don't know what Ben was just going to add there. But he's talking about how a certain aspect of the philosophy of language has changed. The thing that is curious and interesting to me about this discussion is I've never really explored philosophy of language and how it may apply to the way I think about things and the way I come to truth. Because part of this discussion that we're going to get to is how is truth necessarily affected by um, the limitations of language. Ben, oh no, he's back, but still no audio.
Hold on.
There he is. There he is. Gotcha.
Uh, okay, I'm trying to switch my internet to a different one because I
Okay,
think
cool.
I think our internet's just overloaded.
Cool.
Hold on.
Take your time, brother. But yeah, like I was just saying to the people about just general things about what I think about the significance of the philosophy of language and why I wanted to explore it more is because it could have serious implications for what truth is. Because at the end of the day, what this podcast is trying to do is trying to polish our tools or polish the tools that we use to find truth because of it. It seems like today there's so much confusion, yet there's so much information. We're in an information age, yet we seem to be incapable of ciphering through the information to to getting towards truth. Maybe not enough people actually want to find truth. It may be these arguments that we're having about economics, Trump versus Hillary, feminism, welfare, social security, immigration, war. All of these things, hopefully, are not mainly driven by, well, it seems to be mainly driven by emotion. Ben, but maybe if we could provide people or at least provide a small group of people with the ability to sort through misinformation and use certain tools to find truth instead of accepting ideas on their face. So hopefully in this podcast we can achieve something like that by taking a closer look at what language is in itself and being able to see what the limitations are and perhaps even being able to tell a bad use of language over a more clear and precise use of language.
Okay, I'm back, and I hope it'll last.
Nice. Okay, good.
Okay.
Uh, you were just about to say, Kripke's contribution to,
Okay.
uh, yeah,
Okay. So, yeah. So the argument he gave for proper names was that, again, the description that most people would associate with the name Kurt Gödel, who's a famous mathematician, um, would be something like the mathematician who proved the incompleteness theorem.
right.
That's the only thing most people know about him. Uh, but he said if that's the meaning of the name Kurt Gödel, then it should be impossible to discover that Kurt Gödel did not prove the incompleteness theorem. So he says, imagine a situation in which, historians of mathematics discover that Kurt Gödel had actually plagiarized this other guy named Schmidt. Okay. And so now imagine that, again, the only description you associate with Kurt Gödel is the prover of the incompleteness theorem, and some historian of mathematics comes up to you and says, oh, no, Kurt Gödel did not prove the incompleteness theorem. Schmidt did. Well, that would be an impossible discovery if Kurt Gödel just meant the guy who proved the incompleteness theorem. Because what it would amount to would be to say, we discovered that the guy who proved the incompleteness theorem did not prove the incompleteness theorem.
Mm.
So that shows that the meaning of Kurt Gödel cannot just be that, because we can understand meaningfully what it would mean for the bearer of that name to fail to satisfy even all the descriptions that we associated with that name. So that's the general form of the arguments against descriptivism for proper names. Hilary Putnam gave kind of parallel arguments for the case of natural kind terms. So his famous thought experiment was the twin Earth thought experiment, where he says, so obviously on Earth, water refers to H2O. That's what water means on Earth, is H2O, right? So he says, imagine that there is a distant galaxy that is qualitatively identical to ours. Its history is the same. All of its surface features are the same. I have a doppelganger talking on Google Hangouts there right now, as do you, and so forth, with the one exception. On Twin Earth, the chemical composition of what they call water is XYZ. XYZ just being a stand-in for some chemical structure that's different than H2O. Okay. So now he says, rewind the clock back to, say, 1700 on Earth and on Twin Earth, respectively. Okay. So on Earth, this is prior to the discovery that water is H2O. On Twin Earth, it's prior to the discovery that water is XYZ. Now, by hypothesis, both we and twin earthers at this time have identical descriptive contents associated with our terms water. We both pick out water as that colorless, odorless stuff in lakes and rivers that we drink and that falls from clouds, right? So we have identical descriptions, identical psychological states associated with our terms water. Yet, even prior to the discovery, what we mean in 1700 is H2O. What they mean is XYZ. We don't mean the same thing.
Mm.
And the reason we don't mean the same thing is that we are related to distinct types of substance or structure in our environment. And so this is what, again, Putnam came to call semantic externalism, but you could generalize the idea to proper names as well. So the general idea that is theory that comes from these sorts of arguments is that the meaning of at least proper names and natural kind terms is what they actually refer to in the world, and no internal psychological states or conventional descriptions or anything exhausts their meaning, right? So we can't just know the meaning of these things a priori. Their meaning is what they actually refer to in the world, whether we know what that thing is or not, okay? And we refer to that thing rather than some other thing because we're connected to it in the right sort of causal way, right? So earthers, right, have a causal history. We have a history of being in unique causal relations to H2O. Twin earthers and the thought experiment have a unique history of standing in causal relations to the substance XYZ. And it's in virtue of that that we refer to what we refer to and that we mean what we mean. So this semantic externalism, I think, had broad implications for metaphysics and the philosophy of science. At least by many, if not most philosophers, it's been taken to have broad implications. And you can see why this is, because it fits very naturally with metaphysical realism and scientific realism, because it says our language, right, does not structure the world, right? Our internal thoughts and ways of thinking about, right, and etc., that doesn't determine the way the world is. The world determines what we mean, right? The world comes first. Okay. So it fits very naturally with metaphysical and scientific realism, right? So it seems difficult, for example, to be a scientific realist about, say, biological species, if you're a descriptivist, because you would just say, well, what we define as, a particular species rather than another, it just has to do with whatever descriptions we find convenient or we happen to have encountered, right? But they don't carve nature at the joints. But if you are a semantic externalist, right, about biological species terms, say, like tiger, bass, and so forth, then you're going to say that what determines what we mean by those natural kinds is whatever the fundamental structure of those species is, right? What we eventually discover as, say, a certain genetic structure or whatever. So I think philosophy of language is not only interesting and important in itself, but many movements in the philosophy of language, I think this one in particular, have ended up having huge reverberations for much broader questions in philosophy.
I know cognitive science has taken a major role in contemporary thought about this. I wonder how, I'm guessing philosophy of language plays a big part in things like artificial intelligence, maybe. Have you
Um,
would discoveries in philosophy of language have an effect on the way we craft robots, I guess?
Actually, yes, that's a very, very good point. Um, so we've been focusing on language. We usually think of, obviously, language is the set of representational tools, right? That includes, um, you know, uh, phonetic sounds and written signs. Okay, but those are just a particular instance of the more general phenomenon of representation, right? Which is fundamentally a mental phenomenon, right? We just use language, to express, say, like mental representations. Um, so what many people have thought about semantic externalism is that it probably or plausibly entails what's called mental content externalism. Okay, so go back to the Twin thought experiment. So again, we're back in 1700, right? We have H2O, they have XYZ, but we can't tell the difference yet. Everything else is the same. Okay, when I, as an earther, right, have thoughts about water, I'm having thoughts about H2O. Okay.
Hmm.
When I'm reflecting on water or desiring water, I'm reflecting on H2O. I'm desiring H2O, right? Whether I realize it or not. That's the content of my mental states. Similarly, on Twin Earth, when they desire or reflect on water, they're desiring XYZ, or they're reflecting on XYZ, right? So there's a mental content externalism. Even many of our mental states, right, what they're about or directed towards is not fixed by just all the stuff we can access in our own heads, but it's actually determined by what's out there in our environment. So this would have implications, yeah, for artificial intelligence. If we were going to try to build an AI that had what are called propositional attitudes, right? The type of mental state where we're desiring that P, or knowing that Q, or reflecting on R, just mental states that have some sort of content. um, Sorry, I dropped a cup. um, but yeah, so what we would have to do is we would have to build the AI so it had the right sort of causal relationships with its environment, right? So if we were trying to build an AI that had that could think thoughts about tigers, okay, then it would have to be hooked up in the right sort of causal way, or part of the right sort of causal nexus, right, of inputs and outputs with its environment with tigers, right? So you would have to, again, I'm no expert on this stuff, but somehow the robot would have to have causal contact with the things that it was having thoughts about. Okay. Um, so yeah, it has that implication.
I heard briefly Chomsky's addition to the philosophy of language, which was that like babies are born with a structure already in their brain that's
Hmm.
ready to accept language. And you were saying we're not a blank slate. And I think just on that note, the blank slate, I think I never really thought that the blank slate meant there's no a priori structures within the human mind that allows us to build certain things. But
Hmm.
but maybe just in a moral sense, we're a blank slate, or ethical sense, or
Yeah. Well, I think what John Locke, if I remember correctly, really meant by a blank slate was, yeah, I agree with you. I don't think what was meant was that we are not born with the structures that enable knowledge. I mean, obviously that's the case. I think what he meant was that we're not born with innate knowledge, right?
innate, right?
Yeah, hence him being an empiricist, right? We have to experience things in order to gain knowledge of them, but there's no a priori knowledge. But yeah, that doesn't have any implication for whether there are innate structures that enable right knowledge to eventually be generated when it comes in contact with experience. But yeah. So Chomsky, his idea of universal grammar.
Right.
Yeah, so he theorized, yeah, there's some sort of language module in the brain that we all kind of share as a species, and this is what enables us to learn language. So one of the original questions in linguistics and the philosophy of language was this question: how do we learn language, right? Because there are a near infinite number of sentences, right, that can be produced in a language, or that we're always hearing novel sentences constructed throughout our lives, right? So if we learn language just purely through experience, right, then it seems like we could never learn novel sentences, right? Or we can never learn a potentially infinite number of sentences. But we do, and we can, right? We understand sentences. So, for example, I could say to you, the dragon on the mountain is riding a Sasquatch all the way to Pee Wee Hermanville. Okay? You, Now, you've never heard that sentence in your life, I
That's
assume,
true. That's very true.
but you understand it perfectly. Okay, you don't have to learn sentences as discrete units. Okay, there's something that you have intrinsically, and this starts from the beginning of learning language, that allows you to do this. And so the idea is obviously that what we learn when we learn language are rules of construction, and rules that, as Chomsky put it, are infinitely generative. Okay, in the sense that or they're recursive, in that they permit you to input with the basic. So, say, like, give like a logical connective, like and or. Okay, and as long as you know like what the new referential bit refers to, you could understand like a sentence constructed out of that, right? And this is called the compositionality of language. So if I understand what dragon means, and I understand what um, sitting and eating means, and then I understand the rule associated with and the conjunction rule, then I can understand the dragon is sitting and eating, and an infinite series of sentences that are built off those rules, right? The dragon is sitting and eating and blowing fire and on the mountain and riding the Yeti, right? And so forth.
Like,
So,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so related to this, Jerry Fodor talked about an idea that he called mentalese, and this is basically the same kind of idea that we're born with an intrinsic system of representations, right? And we have to assume this to explain how we're able to grasp the meaning of anything in the first place. Um, so, say your parent is trying to teach you the word for rock, okay, and you're at a park, and they're pointing at the rock, okay. They point at it and they say the rock, right? The only way that you could even begin to interpret what's happening is if you're already representing the world in some way, right? You have to already be representing your parent as trying to get you to know something. You have to be representing the pointing as trying to draw your attention to something. And you have to represent the rock as the object of your parent's intended direction, okay? Now, of course, you don't think about it in those terms in any particular language, but you are representing the world, right? In discrete representational structures. And that's clearly the only way that you could get a handle on what's being taught to you in the first place. And so Fodor described the innate system of representations or representational capacities we have. Mentalese, it's an innate mental language, right? Which so Chomsky's idea and Fodor's ideas, which I think are very powerful and very plausible, they run up against, I think, a lot of earlier thought, especially late Wittgenstein, who I think overemphasized language as kind of creating representation or our ability to represent and so forth. It seems much more plausible that we innately are capable of representation, and
Mm.
language reflects our natural internal mental systems of representation. It doesn't create them.
Right, and I think that's supported by the observation about how animals, like if you try to point when you're pointing and saying things and trying to represent the world to a dog or a cat or a lion, they don't make the same connections that, oh, pointing, saying something and whatever is an attempt to describe what this thing is.
Exactly. But that thought actually cuts both ways, though, because on the other hand, we do know that they are representing in some sense, yet they don't have language in any way that's familiar to us. So clearly, for at least the higher mammals, language as we know it is not necessary for representation. So, like Daniel Dennett gave a good example of lions coordinating a hunt of a gazelle. Okay, clearly, in order to have that sort of effective action in the world, the lions have to be representing the gazelle as prey, right? And they have to be representing, their the other lions in the pride in certain ways in order to coordinate with them for the kill and so forth. So they're not thinking, in terms of like discrete symbols of language, but they are representing the world. Okay, and so this is clearly an innate mammalian um, part of our neurological structure that's evolved. We didn't need written or spoken language to give us the ability to represent.
Right, right. And I have sympathy for the logical positivists because I appreciate what they're trying to do, which I think they were trying to force language into strict logical um, true or false statements in order to like make logic super efficient. Because I mean, especially in our world right now, dude, with all these issues and stuff like that, like if there was just a form of language that was mathematical and logical, that if we're talking about presidential stuff or we're talking about major issues, you're only allowed to speak like a logical positivist. You know, just so we can have conversations without it being so wrapped up in emotion and, ego representation and just silly things like that. Well, but I know on the whole the logical positivists have failed.
Hmm.
Why do you think that happened?
So, uh, the central reason um, that it happened was that it was self-refuting. So the insight of the logical positivists and early analytic philosophy generally, that like what you're talking about is mainly the idea of using formal logic to clarify language and bring out its formal structure. That's something that analytic philosophers still very much value. Um, and it has been extraordinarily effective and useful. But the unique thesis of the logical positivists was the semantic thesis of verificationism, that a statement is only, or declarative sentence at least, is only meaningful if you could tell what its verification conditions would be, right? Like what experiences would confirm or falsify it. Okay.
Right.
Um, and of course, that's self-refuting because it's very difficult to think of what sensory experiences would confirm or falsify the verificationist thesis. um,
Okay, I see what you're saying.
but there are some other issues. I'm trying to remember exactly. I think one had to do with. Um, so I think what they said was a sentence is meaningful. Um, how do I say this? Actually, I won't get into this one because I'm not confident enough that I'm going to explain it right. But suffice it to say that there were other issues with logical positivism, but the biggest glaring one that even Ayer eventually abandoned it and recognized this, was that it was is self-refuting. But not only was it self-refuting, but it was kind of ironic because the verificationists viewed themselves as really scientific. They wanted to clean up language so that it served the empirical sciences the best.
Right.
But what they brought out, and this has kind of always been true, is that radical empiricism has always been in somewhat of a tension with scientific realism, right? Especially, Newton, post Newton, and so forth, because especially in physics, right? Some of our key theories, our most successful scientific theories, postulate unobservable entities, right? Subatomic particles, forces, um, electromagnetic radiation, all these sorts of things that you can't directly perceive, but you just see their effects in experiments. Um, so, in order to be a scientific realist and take these theories seriously or interpret them realistically, you can't be a radical empiricist, right? Because these are unobservables, right? And radical empiricists have usually
Mm,
admitted this and said, well, okay, statements in science that involve unobservables are really just reducible to a set of observation statements. But if we're going to have a robust view of science, that doesn't seem too plausible. Anyway, but yeah, so that's the sense in which verificationism was in tension with a more realist view of scientific discovery, um, which became more and more important as modern physics developed, I think.
Dude, that touches on such a big issue for me personally because I'm somebody who wants to put information out to people. Um, I'm somebody who wants to communicate the truth to people, because I think that's going to generally either improve their life or improve something somehow. Um, but I run into this problem of how do I how can I reassure myself that what I'm saying is actually true? And it seems like you have to change your definition of, or, you have to find a place on in empiricism, whether you're radical or moderate. But it's where do you draw the line between saying if you can't experience it, then it doesn't exist, fixed or it didn't happen, versus like versus like
That
um
that that is the best. That is the best summary of the logical positivist I've ever heard. Picks or it didn't happen.
that's what I feel. Where do you draw the line before you can say, all right, I have enough information where I can project this out onto the world while still being intellectually honest? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, I think um, we definitely should be, in some sense, rationalists and evidentialists, but that doesn't mean we need to be empiricists, okay? And I think there are certain types of claim that you need empirical evidence for, okay? Um, like, paradigmatic empirical claims, right? Like, there's a horse in my yard, right? I need empirical evidence for that, right? Or there's a teapot floating behind the moon, right? I need empirical evidence for that. Um, but there are other types of things that are true and that we need evidence for, but that we couldn't ever have empirical evidence for, right? Like ethical claims, aesthetic claims, metaphysical claims, and I think all of those are domains that we can discover truths in and have good or bad arguments for. But the type of evidence involved in them is not empirical evidence. It's just logical argument, thought experiments, a priori reflection, and so forth. So yeah, I mean
Yeah.
that's how I would answer it. Yeah, I definitely agree with you, but I think that the radical empiricist epistemology is just far too limiting and really implausible on its face because it rules out so much of human knowledge and investigation. It seems far more plausible, right? That say there is actual a priori mathematical knowledge than that either there is none or that we somehow gain mathematical knowledge through empirical experience. That seems obviously false. Yet
So
mathematics, though, is central to all of our thinking, including scientific thinking. So the empiricist even runs up against issues again when they're trying to give a robust view of science.
this reminds me of, I maybe I'm not we'll see. I didn't read The Moral Landscape, but I know that he's kind of trying to use science to determine moral laws.
Yeah.
Does that fit with our discussion? Um,
Yeah, it
like,
does. Yeah, so yeah, Sam Harris's book. Yeah, so he basically has obviously a version of moral naturalism. I think he's a utilitarian moral naturalist, but he's a epistemological naturalist about morals as well, right? He thinks, oh, we have to look to science. Um, that's a very interesting question. I'll just say this: even if the type of moral naturalism that can be directly informed by science, uh, like argued for by Sam Harris, were true, right? You still would have to adjudicate the meta-ethical dispute of why moral claims are capable of being confirmed or falsified by scientific evidence. And you can't use scientific evidence to adjudicate that claim. You have to engage in an a priori investigation into the semantics of moral terms.
mm,
And I honestly think there actually is a plausible moral semantics that allows science to have a huge role to play in determining what's moral. But you can't even get to that starting point until you've engaged in the a priori philosophizing where you analyze using counterexamples, thought experiments, and pure logic what we're talking about when we deploy moral terms. Um, so I guess to summarize what I'm trying to say is even if you're a radical moral naturalist ethically, you still have to get there by being a non-naturalist meta-ethically.
Hmm. Well, so can you describe briefly what moral naturalism is?
Yeah, so moral naturalism is the substantive moral theory. It's a broad um, position that it can encompass many particular theories, but it's broadly the position that moral facts are natural facts, right? That in the sense that they're not different from the sort of facts that we can discover through science. Okay, so like utilitarianism is a version of moral naturalism because it says that moral badness is suffering and moral goodness is pleasure. Okay, or mental well-being. And so whether people or populations are experiencing suffering or experiencing pleasure, that's something we can have empirical evidence for, right? One way or another. Um, Testimonial evidence, direct behavioral evidence, right? If people are crying out in despair all the time and, bleeding to death all the time, right? Well, there's probably a lot of suffering going on in that society, right? So those are natural facts, okay, but they're moral facts. So utilitarianism would be a version of moral naturalism, but there are other versions like Aristotelian moral naturalism and several others. But
That
but go ahead.
that's interesting because does that kind of support a relativistic morality? Because if you go to a tribe, a native tribe, and they are doing something totally bizarre, like every 2 days they beat each other with sticks or something like that. But that's something that we would consider immoral, or like sacrifice two children, or something grotesque for us.
Yeah.
Um, but if they're exhibiting happiness and they're showing signs of, or they're not crying out in despair and they have smiles on their faces and stuff, would that kind of justify, or would we be able to say that they're not violating natural moralistic principles? You know what
You're
I'm
saying
saying?
even if like the children being sacrificed are like, jumping into the volcano with a smirk.
Yeah. And they're like,
Okay.
this is the best day of my life. I love this.
Yeah, okay. There's like a diving board. Okay. Um,
But that I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that would give so much credence to kind of like what Sam Harris is saying about the effects of religion, because maybe the only way you can smirk while jumping into a volcano is if you have some kind of irrational belief,
mhm.
um, that you're going to go to heaven, or something's going to save you, or you're whatever.
Yeah, of course, Sam Harris wouldn't like that conclusion because he wants, dogmatic atheism to be the only real thing that makes him really happy.
Yeah,
So,
I know
whatever.
I'm totally detracting from the question I asked you, but I know you. Do you agree with Sam Harris's atheism, or do you like? Because I know you have some religious tendencies. If
Um,
that's, I'm not. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but
well, I mean, just like in the last podcast, I'm agnostic. So no,
oh right.
I don't agree with the level of dogmatic unbelief that Sam Harris and his compatriots have.
So because I know So do you agree with Reza Aslan at all about just the significance of like religious texts? Like they're not, because he always criticizes Sam Harris as like being religious fundamentalists, because he can only interpret, you know, like he'll interpret the Quran as literal, that anybody who reads it is compelled to, kill the infidels.
Hmm.
But go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he has a point there. I mean, I am not remotely the biggest fan of Reza Aslan, but yes, he has a point there. Um, I think they both have points in different ways. I think Sam Harris has a point when he says that there are certain texts or passages in religious scriptures that you'd have to do, interpretive backflips to interpret them in a metaphorical um, or allegorical way. Some are clearly written to be history, even if you think that history is false or made up. Okay. Um, Now, of course, it's always up to an individual to read whatever in whatever way they want, and maybe reading a historical genre in a metaphorical way makes them happy, whatever. But Sam Harris has an important point that if you're going to take the religious text seriously, and some of the genres, or maybe the entire genre of the text is history, right? Then you're not really being faithful to the text by having a completely non-literalist interpretation of it. So Sam Harris has a point there. Reza Aslan has a point in that it's just not the case that every religious text is meant to be the genre of history. Especially the biblical text is, again, 66 plus books written over hundreds of years. Some of those books, like Job, are allegory. The early passages of Genesis are clearly allegory. Leviticus is history. The New Testament books are history. Again, not in the sense that everything happened, but in the sense they're written to be historical accounts, right?
Mm.
The Psalms are poetry. The Proverbs are proverbs. um, so there's no, at least when it comes to the biblical text, there's no one way to read it. And I guess by 6 degrees, this relates to our philosophy of language stuff. Um, but yeah, so there's
Yeah, we didn't go too far. We're a little bit
yeah.
tangent, but still somewhat in the playing field.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean we hit the hour mark. We could keep going. There was one more thing I wanted to say. So, what do you think is like the future of the philosophy of language? I know that's incredibly difficult question, or maybe what do you hope to see come out of philosophy of religion?
Of language, you mean?
I'm sorry,
Yeah, I
philosophy of
gotcha.
language.
I gotcha. Philosophy of religion, I hope someone just proves the damn thing one way or another. But um, philosophy of language, I think its history is very vibrant. I think it'll continue being a very vibrant field of philosophy. What I hope will come from it is uh, I hope more and more of a vindication of common sense and realism. My general philosophical disposition is um, to believe that there is a world out there, right? It has objective features, and we're able to describe those features approximately when we reason well about them. And so I very much welcome these recent trends like semantic externalism and direct reference, and mental content externalism in philosophy, because I think they help to substantiate more of a less skeptical and a more realistic view of the world. So I hope that trend continues. I hope philosophy doesn't dip back into a kind of uh, skepticism, internalism, kind of Kantianism, where we think, well, or idealism, we're cut off from the world in some way, and um, yeah, because I don't think we are, and I think the arguments that we are can, as G.E. Moore famously did, be refuted by just putting up your hand and saying, "Here is a hand. Okay, I know at least one thing in the world exists."
Yeah, you know who really helped me with that? Like I remember in the beginning of my philosophy career, I was like, or just majoring at UCF. Well, I was such a cynic and such a skeptic. I wouldn't allow myself to believe anything was real. I was totally in that. If I can't prove my hand is real, then it might not be. If I can't prove I exist, then I might not. Type thinking.
Hmm.
But it wasn't until I forget his name. He was like the most accomplished philosophy professor we had, and then he moved to another school like in Texas. An analytic philosopher. I forget his name, and that kid Benaguda.
Oh yeah, yeah. He was. Yeah, I know he studied phenomenology. I already forgot his
Phenomenology.
name. Yeah.
Yeah, but an argument he made in one of his papers was that like there's different layers of reality. There's the subatomic, and then there's the infinite outer space. And yes, it's true that on the subatomic level we don't exist and nothing exists, just these electric pulses, and in the infinite universe we're nothing pretty much. But on our plane, on the human plane, things do matter. There are repercussions for our actions. Morality does
Hmm.
exist, even though it might not exist on other planes. And he that argument pretty much pulled me from it woke me from my dogmatic slumber, if you will. But yeah, I think that's a good point. And I like you said, I hope I feel like we have the ability to clean up our language. We have the ability to speak precisely. Just like
I
I feel
agree.
like we have the ability to, totally change the energy sources we use in the world. We have the ability to feed everybody in the world. But there always seems to be these things that prevent us from accomplishing those goals. And it's also really cool to think that language, if we just focus on language instead of maybe focusing on what we can create with science, or not to disparage science at all, but maybe if we just clean up our language, we can further the human species. And that's something that's not even discussed, that's not even remotely hinted at in popular thought and popular uh, issues.
I completely agree. I think especially in political and social discourse, I think half half of the the vitriol and the misunderstanding and the unproductiveness of discourse could be resolved or at least vastly improved if we could more effectively point out where ambiguity existed, where equivocation existed, what someone was really trying to say, as opposed to how we were just kind of interpreting them. And um, so, yeah, I agree. I agree. Clarity is one of the supreme virtues of human thought and philosophy in particular. And
Bam!
formal logic can help a lot with that.
Nailed it. What do you say? Clarity is. Say that again.
Supreme virtue of human thought. Take that one to the
Supreme
bank.
virtue of human thought. That is so refreshing to hear because it's so true and it's so lacking.
I know they don't call me Dasani for nothing, babe.
Dude, I can't wait to see you as a professor and spewing the truth, developing a small cult of students. Um, that's gonna be really cool. Yeah, so I don't know, but yeah, like I don't want to talk about what you just accomplished on air or anything, but that's really cool, man. And thank you for contributing to the podcast as much as you do. And
Thank
thank you,
you.
brother.
Thank you. Love being on. Thanks for making such a good podcast, interesting and facilitating awesome discussion.
Yeah, I'm gonna try. Like I said, I have some interesting guests coming on, and we're gonna see where this thing goes.
Cool. Keep me posted.
All right, my brother.
All right. Peace out.
See ya.